Hi everyone, my name is Richard Harbridge. I'm a Microsoft MVP and CTO of TutorLead, and I wanted to take a moment to talk about the Employee Wellbeing Report, which was actually released in just before Microsoft Inspire, but it was kind of re-announced at Microsoft Inspire, and that is sort of a joint report with obviously Microsoft and Glint, which was a purchase investment from Microsoft as well in the recent years.
TutorLead is a remote-first company based out of Canada.
What makes a world-class Microsoft 365 intranet and digital workplace?
So Microsoft, when they looked at employee experience, they look at the holistic employee experience. Now, for us, we often break that down digitally to, employee communication experience, employee collaboration experience, and employee management experience. But when you think about the Microsoft workloads like Microsoft Viva, or even what Glint does when it comes to measuring employee engagement, there's a lot we can learn from reports like this one. So I thought we'd just dig right in and we talk a little bit about what's in the report and what you can yourself maybe interpret from the data. I won't go through every bit of the report just for the sake of time. I'll just focus on the parts that I think are most applicable. For this first chart, I'm really not going to talk too much about it. I don't think there's that much you can interpret from it, aside from a really great click through here that I would recommend for those who are interested in measuring happiness at work or employee engagement, to note, be careful with favorability scores like a net promoter score and how that could potentially skew the data. And I think this is a really great resource to learn more about that if you yourself want to explore that. But again, generally speaking, what we're finding is, while we saw generally dips within employee happiness during the pandemic for a variety of reasons, we are seeing a bit more stability now, which is great to see around employee happiness and by proxy a lot of the employee engagement scores. You also find within the report a really excellent summary here of the declining remote work. So we know that the remote work during the core of the pandemic was quite high as it accelerated very rapidly. Thanks again to all those digital first responders and all those who adapted to that. But now we see a bit of a normalization. And as mentioned by many people, we do expect that hybrid work and fully remote work will be here to stay in much larger numbers than before. And that this dynamic of having more hybrid work and remote work has some new challenges. As an example, during the pandemic, there was a little bit more leeway and flexibility, both from an employee expectation perspective and from a leadership expectation perspective, on how we have to track and work towards employee engagement, making sure we have a great employee experience for hybrid and remote work. Everyone kind of understood that we were all in crunch time as we worked to make that kind of function and us to be successful and effective. But now many employees that have been remote are used to it. That's become a common use case for them. They're used to certain patterns and practices. They like to see that improve. And many that are in the hybrid experience are really feeling that pain as there's more and more of employees in the in-person environment in the hybrid state. That makes it harder and harder for those remote employees to feel like they're a key part of the organization, that they feel connected, and so it can create a variety of new challenges. So what's interesting about this overall is that the data is not too surprising, but it's very helpful to understand that the vast majority of people do have some level of remote work. And I think that's something that we should pay close attention to. Now, to be clear, this data set that from this report is around 3,000 people from a LinkedIn set of surveys. So it's important to understand these are professional people. And again, LinkedIn generates more or less more responses in remote culture anyways. So I do think that this data is probably not accurate from an industry perspective. That said, some areas of the industry like startups and other things like that are going to see a greater influence of remote work, or in certain workload role types, et cetera. You'll see that as well. So take all this data with a grain of salt, but it definitely suggests that hybrid work and offsite or remote work is not just here to stay, but it's the majority of the employee experience today. And we need to make sure we take that into account. An interesting bit of data from all of that was that we see individual contributors generally have more representation in that fully remote work environment than managers and directors. And this makes a bit of sense in that a lot of managers and directors have a lot of meetings, generally speaking, and a lot of times when people talk about the effectiveness of remote work, they do generally say that meetings they prefer in a hybrid or in-person state, just for that connectivity and those feelings and being able to look at people's faces and things like that. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have really effective meetings as a remote participant, but it is important to note that there's some interesting data sets within this to help us understand how's the distribution look across managers versus individual contributors, and where is it trending? It's certainly trending. While a decline from our peak numbers, we do expect that this will eventually stabilize and continue to trend upward. There are some other really interesting insights in here around being intentional. I really like this term, intentional, about building connections with coworkers and teams. One of the things that a lot of us have experienced is, before the pandemic, we had a lot of in-person events, and really the company barbecue or things like that was a great way to connect with employees, especially outside of your working group. And without those networking opportunities or those like physical events, many of us have not had really the time or energy to create proper equivalencies from a remote and hybrid workforce, and it's really important to have those. So there are a few ideas actually in this vein that we've created, and I thought I would just take a moment to talk about some of those other related resources, because again, this is a great starting point, but there's some other things you might want to take a look at. So as an example, within the idea book, so this is a M365 ideas.com. If you go to m365ideas.com, you can download it. It has a lot of different samples of ideas and things to improve employee experience. Some of them are actually really useful, like Icebreaker in here as an example, which highlights the ability to connect, two different people or more people with each other, and kind of, again, break down boundaries and connect people across working groups and things like that, who just wouldn't have that opportunity for mentorship or connection otherwise. So that's a great way to be intentional by creating new opportunities for remote work. Another big one I mentioned earlier is that hybrid work is really where a lot of pain is today, where people are, maybe a little bit familiar with the direction of how do I effectively work remotely, but they're struggling with this change within the organizational ecosystem of what does it mean to be successful in a hybrid work scheme, and what are the expectations and how does that flow. So there's a wonderful resource called the Workplace Transformation Site. You can actually download this yourself if you don't want to click through the links in the idea book at lookbook.microsoft.com. But essentially what this has is it has a site with a bunch of Microsoft research material within it that helps organizations create a sort of a hub for users within the organization or employees within the organization to learn more about how to be successful in a hybrid work environment. And so this is an important example of something that has intention. If you're HR, you're building a better employee experience, it's important to have these spaces that have guidance for what is the day in the life of our hybrid workplace. What is our hybrid workplace? What is our stances on things? What are the overall rules that apply everywhere? And what are the rules that are up to management or specific based on role, the kind of role you have and things like that. So having more of this data, having your own version of this sort of glint report with your internal data is a great example of something to surface within a site like this. And there's really no excuse because you have this wonderful template that you can use as a starting point within sort of the Microsoft ecosystem. So let me take a step back and go to the report again as we dig in to the other later sections of the report. Another element of this that was really interesting was they did talk about manager, the role of the manager quite a bit. So successful hybrid work, managers need to support flexibility, and we do see regional differences within flexible support. Now this is an interesting term, flexible work, because there's a variety of new challenges with flexible work that we're seeing in the market. One of the examples is that, of course, some people are working remotely, but those who've gotten used to working remotely, who got that time back from that commute, right, who may have gotten up early in the morning to beat traffic, for those people, they now might have a very different rhythm for their work. They might really like to work early and kind of end early. They might want to work late and start early or later, as an example. And so based on people's own schedules and flexibility, there is this accommodation that most organizations are need to support. Now, yes, there's sort of standard times when people generally are available, or there's times where your teams, especially at a team level, managers kind of create essentially some norms for expectations. But with more and more people in multiple time zones, because we've also seen more and more people move during the pandemic, often to areas that are in a different time zone or sort of further away from major cities and things of that nature, what we're seeing is, again, a greater emphasis on this flexibility. So to be competitive and to keep employees, the ones we want employed, we're going to have to be flexible, but you can definitely see that there's a difference in perceived support for flexibility. Do they feel that their manager is supporting that or not? And I think this is a really good call out for North America, that there's quite a bit more we can do to improve here. And since that's where all of our customers generally are and where we spend most of our time, I thought that was very helpful. And there's some other insights here. I'm going to kind of skip over these. Not that they're not important, but again, they're just great reference points to some of the patterns that I've already talked about. What I wanted to talk about was this particular one, which is the sense of employee connection. Now, I mentioned earlier these mixed or hybrid work arrangements are probably the biggest culprit for people feeling like there's lower connection. And it's a bit of a conundrum, because you'd think if people are getting that in-person time, they would feel more connected, which is what we normally expect, right? Often we see leaders forcing people to come in on site for certain days just to encourage that sense of connectivity. But what we're seeing is that people feel that they have a lower sense of connection in that hybrid work environment. And so I think it's really worth evaluating within your own team. If you're, a team leader, is this the right model for us? Especially that mandated model, we find creating a lot of challenges. And then two, if your idea is to say, oh, well, your in-person connection is how you connect with employees, you're probably doing it wrong, since the vast majority of employees, as we mentioned, are going to be remote, hybrid, or remote employees. And so it makes more sense to emphasize the remote first employee connectivity. And I think that there are some really big announcements that are exciting from Microsoft Inspire that we'll talk about, like Viva Engage and other things like that allow employees to have a voice and connect, not just in Yammer communities and places like that have already existed, kind of again to connect outside your working group, but that there's other ways to create your voice, to create a sense of connection with other peers, and to do it in a more accessible way, because it's much easier to create a little video snippet as an example than long form text. So again, lots more work we need to do, and there's more ideas in that idea book that I mentioned earlier, like the Icebreaker app and solutions like that again, you can just go download and try yourself, that help create more sense of connectivity between remote employees. And I think if more customers of ours, and more in general organizations, attacked employee experience from a remote first and hybrid workforce priority perspective, you'd actually find generally an improvement in employee connection there. At least that's what we see for those organizations that have rolled out those patterns. We do these kinds of employee engagement surveys using Glint, actually, and sort of the Microsoft Viva framework to get that data. Now, there's some other interesting aspects to all of this, which is, I really found this interesting, that lower connectivity often is relatively universal. So this is interesting in that many people generally feel that it's an obstacle to successful remote work. So you might say, well, okay, does it really matter if these remote employees are disconnected from one another outside of their working groups and things like that, or even in their working groups? And what we're finding is, yes, many people feel that is quite problematic. So I think, these data points show that no matter what your org size is, it doesn't change the fundamentals that we need to make sure that people are feel connected inside their teams, feel connected with their managers, especially that's a big problem today. As we've shifted with a little bit more remote work, not every manager is skilled at hybrid and remote employee management, so that has to be improved. And there's a lot more there to think about. But I do like that this is relatively consistent. Sure, it's a bigger problem generally within larger organizations, but it's still very fundamentally a challenge within smaller organizations as well. And it is an obstacle. It impedes the overall effectiveness or efficiency of those employees, right? And they could be a lot better at getting their work done if they were more connected for a variety of reasons. Now, I won't go through all these. I think these are really great representations of why these particular things, are so important. So I'll kind of skip over. And that's really the end of it. I just wanted to talk about a few of the data points. I really, really think the overall message here is that hybrid and remote employees need better employee experiences. They need to feel more connected, and we need to be intentional on how we tackle that particular problem, because it's not going away. So I hope that's been helpful for you, that you found some useful insights there. If you felt I missed anything, or if you yourself saw a different report, or like the example I showed of the idea book, if there's other resources out there that you think are very actionable, feel free to share in the comments in YouTube or wherever you see this video. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye for now.